Many times in life, in history, and in our own experience, a single act of courage becomes a tipping point for something extraordinary to happen in our world. When an individual makes one bold, one courageous act, it becomes a transition into something that completely changes the entire flow and the entire course of human history. And when this happens, the people involved have no idea what's at stake. The people involved weren't planning on changing the course of human history, but they just found themselves in a situation where the way that circumstances were flowing, it bothered them and it bothered their conscience, and they decided that although they had no idea what was hanging in the balance, they were going to do something to make the world right. And through those acts of courage, lives are changed and even history is changed. For example, in 1989, a single protester stood in front of a line of tanks in Tiananmen Square, defying an entire communist regime in China. Because the protester felt that the evils that existed in this government could not be tolerated, and he was going to do what he could do, so he stood in defiance. And this act of courage was so powerful that to this day in China, images and videos of that incident are blocked because they do not want people to get the idea that they can stand against the government. On December 1st, 1955, an African American woman decided that she was not going to give up her seat on the bus to a white man. And little Rosa Parks, that no one had ever heard of before, woke up that morning and got ready for work like she does on every morning. And she got on her bus like she did every morning. But on that day, she decided that no matter what happens, I am going to stick up for what I believe is right, and she would not move to the back of the bus. And little did she know that she was about to become an international symbol for civil rights. And it would help usher in a transition, a tipping point for the civil rights movement in this country. On October 31st, 1517, an unknown Roman Catholic monk decided that he had to do something about what he believed. What he believed was corruption within the Catholic Church. And he had no position to do anything, so all he did is he wrote a document and he published it, and he said, hey, does anybody want to talk about this? Because this is bothering my conscience. I want to talk about this. Anybody, anytime, anywhere. And little did he know, Martin Luther was about to completely change the course of the history of all of Western civilization, and people 500 years later, whether they're Christians or not, their lives would be impacted by his single act of boldness. On September 11th, 2001, United Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco was hijacked by Islamic terrorists. And when passengers on that airplane called their loved ones to let them know what was going on, their loved ones told them they were the fourth plane hijacked that day, and the other three had been used by terrorists to smash into the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon. And in a single act of courage, the passengers on that plane decided, we're not going to risk letting this plane become another weapon for terrorists against our country. And they stormed the cockpit of the plane, forcing the terrorists to crash into an empty field rather than lose control of the aircraft. It is in these single acts of courage that lives are changed, that history is changed. Over and over and over, we read about it. We hear about it. We see it in our world. Now, in our mind, these stories are so big, and it's kind of hard to relate to them for our lives every day, because odds are you are never going to be asked to give up your seat on a bus to someone of another race. Okay, odds are you're never going to be in a position to stand up against a regime as big as the Holy Roman Empire or against a communist government in China. Okay, odds are you're never going to be in a position where you are going to be the person who can save hundreds, if not thousands, of lives in a single act of courage. Our lives probably aren't going to be written into history books, granted. But the same truth still applies to you. And in your life, there will be moments where, if you act with boldness and courage, it will transition a tipping point that impacts your life, that impacts your legacy, that impacts your faith, that impacts our generation. And you will either act on those moments or you will fail to act. Well, today we're starting a new series. It's a series on the life of a man who is one of the most influential people in all of human history. And in fact, although this man lived 4,000 years ago, your daily life is impacted by the life he lived 4,000 years ago. The man we're going to be looking at was named Abraham. Abraham is so significant in history that the three major religious faiths of our world and several minor religious faiths all look to Abraham as the father of their faith. Judaism, Christianity, Islam all say we are the spiritual descendants of Abraham. What's more, the entire Jewish ethnic race, along with all of the Arabs of the world, trace their genealogies and their entire races back to Abraham. And DNA testing has been done, and sure enough, there's a genetic signature that all goes back to that same source. 58% of the world's population alive today claim some kind of connection to Abraham. Here's what that means. Even if you're not a Christian, this series is worth the price of your attention, because you are not going to understand civilization today if you do not understand the life of Abraham. But more personally and more practically perhaps for most of us, if you don't understand the life of Abraham, you are not going to understand how to live a big life. You are not going to understand how to live a life of courage. Now, the challenge for us living so far removed from Abraham is he's such an abstract figure in history. He lived so long ago. We don't know all the details of the world he lived in. We've learned a lot from archaeology, but there's some we don't know what some of the details were like. So I tried to think, is there a modern figure? Is there someone alive today that if we could look at this person, it would kind of give us a feel of the kind of man that Abraham was? What kind of dude was Abraham? And I thought of every person on our planet today that's a famous, that's a celebrity, that's an athlete, who is a lot like Abraham? And I could only come up with one person. It was this guy. Chuck Norris. Now, here's why. Don't laugh. This is real. You don't laugh in church. It's always serious. Life doesn't happen to Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris happens to life. Okay? That's the kind of guy that Abraham was. In fact, when the story of Abraham picks up and he was 75 years old, guess who turned 75 this year? Chuck Norris. Coincidence? You'll have to figure that out over brunch. I don't know if that's a coincidence, but how many of you are fans of Chuck Norris? Any Chuck Norris fans in the room? Okay. How many of you are fans of Chuck Norris jokes? You don't really care about Chuck Norris, you just like the Chuck Norris jokes. How many of you, let's be honest, how many of you have never heard a Chuck Norris joke before? Let's get your hands up real high. All right. I am about to improve the quality of your life, because that's what we do at Hope. And let me say in advance, you're welcome. All right, Chuck Norris jokes. They go something like this. Chuck Norris is so deadly, he can kill 2 stones with 1 bird. Chuck Norris can win a game of Connect 4 in 3 moves. When Alexander Bell invented the telephone, he had 3 missed calls from Chuck Norris. One time, Superman bet that he could beat Chuck Norris in a fight. Loser has to wear his underwear on the outside. Okay. Chuck Norris jokes, right? And he's become this mythical figure in our own generation where we say, hey, Chuck Norris happens to life. Abraham, he kind of lived the same kind of life, to be honest. Life didn't happen to Abraham. Abraham happened to life. And in fact, the reason why he is such an influential person to this day in civilization is because his life was defined by a series of courageous acts. And in acting on those opportunities he was given, the course of his life was changed, the course of his faith was changed, and the course of all of human history was changed. But here's what's interesting. When we peel back the details on the life of Abraham, here's what we discover. The reason why he made those courageous acts and lived the way he did was not because he was a man of initiative. It's not because he was a man of ambition. It's not because he was so creative. But it was because he lived a life in response to God's call. Abraham was a man who was called by God, and he lived his life responding to the calling of God in his life. And the reason why he became such a great person is because he listened to and answered the calling of God in his life. That's what defined his life. And here's what's true for you today. God has a calling on your life. Some of you believe that God has a calling on your life. You just don't know what that is or how to figure it out. Some of you have no idea at this point what that even means or what I'm talking about when I say God has a calling on your life. But I believe the reason why you are listening to this is because it's one of the ways that God is calling you. See, God's calling is not a voice you hear with your ears. It is a calling, you hear it in your soul, you hear it in your heart, you hear it in your mind. It is a calling that does not originate inside of you. It is a calling that comes from outside of you. There's some times where you'll be in a position to hear it. When you have the Bible open and you're reading it, you are positioned to hear God's calling on your life. Some of you don't believe the Bible's God's word. Hey, you don't have to. Just go read one of the stories of the life of Jesus from the Bible and see what you hear. One time Jesus said that when 2 or 3 come together in his name, that he will be there and he will show up. This is why we love to gather as the church. Because when we come together in Jesus' name, Jesus said, I'm going to be there with you, which means, Jesus, we are so glad you are here today. And I ask that in this series, you will do what only you can do. And you will call these men and you will call these women, and they will hear your voice. And if you are not a Christian today, it is the call of God that makes you a Christian. And if your life doesn't seem to have a lot of focus or meaning, it is the call of God that gives your life purpose. Or if you are a person who is incredibly ambitious, it is the call of God that reroutes your ambition towards something that is so much bigger than you and your goals, and it completely replaces that with a bigger ambition about Him. That's what the call of God does in our lives. So today we're going to get started in understanding what this call of God is. And we're going to do that by beginning the story of the life of Abraham. We're going to be starting at the end of Genesis chapter 11. We're going to pick up the story in verse 27. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. So we're introduced to Abraham by learning about his dad and his siblings. Terah was Abraham's dad. Abraham had 2 brothers, Nahor and Haran, and he had a nephew named Lot. There's this whole family now you know. Now, in this series, you'll see sometimes Abraham is named in the Bible as Abraham, sometimes Abram. Don't let it throw you. It's the same guy. He started out as Abram. Later, his name was changed to Abraham. Abraham means father of many. That's what his name was changed to. His birth name was Abram, which means great father, or more literally in American, big daddy. That's what Abram means. So Terah had huge ambitions or a lot of swagger or something. Hey, what should we name our boy? Let's name him Big Daddy. Imagine that being your name on the playground growing up. That was Abraham. There's his family. Next verse. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. So they're from Ur of the Chaldeans. Haran died before he reached a ripe old age, his brother. They're in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. Modern day, that's Iraq, that area of the world. Very different back then. This is still 2,600 years before Muhammad and Islam came around. So it was a very polytheistic, very tribal region of the world. In fact, Ur is known as the center of lunar worship, of moon worship in the ancient world. That's Abraham's hometown. That's where he grows up. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. So Abram's brother, he's a little freaky. He marries his niece, and that's kind of where the story ends, so we won't go any further with that part of the family tree. Now, Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, that's not his son's name, that's another part of the world. When they came to Haran, they settled there. And that's a key idea. We're going to come back to that idea of settling there. But let's zoom out, and you have to see what the narrator of this story is trying to tell us. If you pay close attention to these words, what you discover is that this is a tragedy that is taking place. All of human history is coming to a dead end in these verses. Let me explain what I mean. If you start at the beginning of Genesis and begin to read through it, what you discover is that in Genesis chapter 2, God had the world just the way he wanted it, and it's the way we want the world to be too. A place where there is no pain, there is no sadness, there is no abuse, there is no heartache, there is no death. It was a perfect paradise. But Genesis 3 through 11, and again, if you don't believe there was a perfect world or God created it, if you can't go that far today, hey, that's fine. You don't have to believe that today. The reason why Christians believe that, in case you're wondering, is because Jesus said it was true, and when you can predict your own death and resurrection and then do it, we just go with whatever you have to say. We're really simple that way. But Genesis 3 through 11, even if you don't believe the creation, tells the story of the disintegration of the human race. Okay, you've got perfect world in Genesis 2. Sin enters the world. With it comes hurt, pride, violence, oppression, deceit, war, all kinds of evil. And Genesis 3 tells the decline of all of human civilization. It gets worse and worse. The abuse gets worse and worse. The violence grows worse and worse. And it is a runaway train by the time we get to chapter 11. Now, through this narrative section, there's one ray of hope, and it's the family line of a man named Seth. Seth was a worshiper of God. He taught his children to worship God. He was the one person, the one family tree in the world that still believed in and worshiped the Lord. But something terrible has happened. Terah, Abraham's father, his name means moon. Living in the epicenter of lunar worship, there's this guy named Moon. You say, maybe that's just a coincidence. Maybe he still worshiped God. Look at what we find a few books of the Bible later in Joshua. Joshua 24:2. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshiped other gods. By the way, this word worshipped in the Hebrew language, it is not singular. He worshipped, as in Terah worshipped. It is plural. They worshipped other gods. What the narrator is leading us to see is that the last candle of faith is being snuffed out in the world. The last people who cling to God and worship him, it's going out. And it's even worse than that. Physically, this family is also being extinguished. We're told that Sarah, the wife of Abram, is barren. She cannot have any kids. This family is about to literally be extinguished. Spiritually, it's been extinguished. And this is a hopeless situation we find ourselves in. And the only way that this train is going to be stopped is if God intervenes. But that's what the call of God does. When God calls, it intervenes into our lives. In fact, it's a very disruptive force in our life. We're going to see that God's call comes to Abraham, and it absolutely disrupts everything that was going on in his life. But the question is, why would God call Abraham to begin with? Here's a guy, he's a pagan, he worships idols, he's from the wrong part of the world, it's just everything's wrong about him. Why would God start with him? Why would God call him? Here's the first thing you need to know about God's calling. God's call comes to the unworthy. God's call does not come to the worthy. It does not come to the good. God's call comes to men and women who are unworthy. God calls Abraham, whose family worships the moon, to say, I'm going to use you in a powerful way in this world. Now, have you ever had a mess to clean up that was so big you did not know where to start cleaning up the mess? One time, when we still lived in Boise, right before we moved here, we were starting to get our house ready to put on the market. And in the pantry in our kitchen, we had a huge jar of salsa up on the top shelf, right? And I'm in the pantry. And you know how this story ends. Somehow the thing of salsa falls. And I'm telling you, when it hit the floor, it went off like a salsa grenade in my pantry. It went up 3 walls and the door and all over the floor, and every bag, every can of food, every kitchen appliance just covered in salsa. And I just stood there looking at it for a minute. I closed the door. I'm like, Kathy, we're moving. Just let's go. Grab the kids. We're moving to Wisconsin right now, right? But sometimes you find a mess that is so big, I don't even know where to start cleaning this up. God looked at the world he made, and he's like, Gabriel, did you drop the salsa? Have you seen this mess? Gabriel's like, holy cow, how are you even going to start cleaning up this mess, God? That's a huge mess. God says, you know where I'll start cleaning up this mess? That guy. Which one? Abraham. God, he worships the moon. Have to start somewhere. But God, he's unworthy. They're all unworthy. I don't call the worthy, I call the unworthy because I'm a God of grace. I'm starting with Abraham, and I'm going to clean up the mess that sin has caused in this world. Here's what you need to know about God. God calls unworthy people. He does not call worthy people. In fact, it is the calling of God on your life that is the thing that makes you worthy. The prerequisite to being called by God is to be unworthy. If you have ever struggled with wondering if God can love me, if God can accept me, if God can forgive me, if when I die God could ever welcome me into his presence, you need to know that God calls the unworthy. He not only calls them to belong to him, he calls them to do extraordinary things in his world. Now, the call came to Abraham. Chapter 12, verse 1 tells us about it. The Lord had said, past tense, the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. So already, when they were in Ur, God called Abram. He said, Abram, it's time to go. So Abraham left, Terah came along, Lot came along, Nahor came along, everybody came along and said, great, we're tired of the desert, we'll all go. And so they started this big migration, and they got to the place where they settled. So God says to Abraham, well, if they're going to settle there, then you get up and go. The Hebrew word for go is more powerful than just go. It literally means get yourself out. Even if you are all alone, get yourself out from your country. Get yourself out from your people. Get yourself out from your father's household. Abraham says, great, where am I going? I'll tell you when you get there. I will show you when you arrive. You just need to get out, and you need to begin to go to the land I will show you. Because at its heart, God's call is open-ended. At its heart, God's call asks to trust him wherever he's leading us, even though we do not know. God says, start walking, and I'll let you know when you arrive. And that's the second thing you need to know about God's call. God's call is to go from the familiar in your life, from the familiar to the unknown, to what is unknown, to a different place. Now, as a pastor, I've had all kinds of questions about people who are becoming Christians, from people who are becoming Christians. They say, Jason, okay, so about that tithe thing, do I have to give 10%, if I start going to church? Do I have to break up with him if I become a Christian? Do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? And when I was a young pastor, I was dumb enough to answer those questions. And I'd say, biblically, you should give this percent and do that and all that. And here's what I realized. They're not trusting God to go from what's familiar to what's unknown. They're saying, I want to see where you're calling me to go to, God. Before I go there, let me evaluate whether or not I trust you, whether or not I like where you're calling me to. God says, no. Doesn't work that way. I'm calling you to get out from your pagan culture, he says, and go to the place I will show you. And I'll tell you when you get there. That's what God does. He says to Abraham, go, and Abraham says, where? And God says, I'll show you when you get there. And later, as we'll see in the series, God will say to Abraham, you are going to have a son. And Abraham says, how? And God says, just trust me. And then finally, God will say to Abraham, it's time to sacrifice your son to me. And Abraham says, why? And God says, just start climbing that mountain. You do not ask if God's call will fit into your agenda. God's call is a disruptor. It disrupts your agenda. It becomes your agenda. You do not ask if Christianity will enhance my life. You do not ask if God will enhance my life. The call of God, it disrupts your life. It becomes your agenda. It becomes your time. It becomes your pursuit. The call of God disrupts everything, and it completely disrupted Abraham's nice, comfortable life. You like your home country? You like living in a house? Time to go. You like your friends? You like your family? Time to go. Get out, and I will tell you where to go. As I was thinking about this, I realized that a lot of us, we're like Terah, Abraham's father. See, the place God would eventually have Abraham settle was in Canaan. That's an 1,100-mile migration from Ur of the Chaldeans. Haran, where they settled, was at the halfway point. Terah got halfway in obeying God's call, and he settled there. He said, that's good enough. Could it be that some of you are pulling a Terah in your life? God has called you. You got halfway there, and then you settled. And for some of you, God is calling you to generosity. And somewhere along the path, you settled, you compromised. You didn't go all the way in following God's calling. For some of you, you've been called to prioritize your family for a season of life, but to be honest, you've settled, you compromised. You did not follow God's call all the way. You went halfway, and you look back and you said, look at how far I've come. I'm great. I'm way better than the people I work with. Look at how good I'm doing. But you compromised. You settled. You did not go all the way in obedience to God's calling. God has called you to prioritize your relationship with Him, your faith in Him. And He has called you to do that because what's more important than living forever somewhere? The one thing you get to keep forever is your relationship with God. And He says, I want you to prioritize that. I want that to be the consuming priority of your life. But some of you settled. You said, well, hey, I go to church now. That's good enough, right? You settled. You compromised. You did not go all the way in obedience to God's calling. And listen. I'm not saying this to lecture you. I'm saying this to let you know that you are the one who is missing out. You are the one who is missing out on the opportunities to follow God's call. And in those moments of courage, in those moments of bravery, when you fully obey God's call, those are the moments that become the tipping point. that transitions something extraordinary into your life, something extraordinary into your faith, something extraordinary into your family, something extraordinary into our generation. But you only went halfway. Abraham was extraordinary, not because of his initiative, but because he obeyed the call of God. I've been staring at this text for 4 weeks. Getting ready to explode because I haven't preached in 4 weeks. It's brutal. I'll be honest. I'm starting to think as a church, we've pulled a Terah. I'm starting to think that we went halfway and we settled, to be honest. And it's my fault. I'm the pastor here. It's my fault. But hey, we're growing. Hey, we've got a great stage. Hey, music's great. It's all great. We're growing. Budget's great. It's all great. Yeah, high five. Aren't we awesome? But I think I don't know. I get this nagging sense, church. We're compromising. God's calling us to something bigger, to something more courageous, to something bolder than where we're at. And I hope you'll join me, because for this series, I'm going to be praying about this, to discern God's voice and to see if He isn't calling us to something bigger than that. Because if we do not obey God's calling, and if we pull a Terah and go halfway, we're the ones who miss out on those moments that change everything in a generation, that change the course of human history. Well, God's not just going to send Abraham out with nothing but a calling and a command. God's calling is always accompanied by promises of His presence and grace. Check out these promises He gives to Abraham in verse 2. He said, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So we see the first 4 promises God gives Abraham. First one is this: I will make you into a great nation. Here's what's amazing. Abraham was 75 years old when he got this promise, and he did not have any children. And you're going to be made into a great nation. That might take a while, okay? That'd be like you calling the ambulance, I'm having a heart attack, and the dispatcher says, well, as soon as we get that engine rebuilt, we'll have it right over and we'll take you to the hospital. That's going to take a little too long. Abraham's wondering, how long is this going to take? Yet, here's what's amazing. Today in our world, the entire Jewish race raises their hands and say, we're that great nation. And the Arab race says, no, we're that great nation. The amazing thing is, this happened. Abraham became a great nation. Second thing, God said, I will bless you. Obedience to God's calling is accompanied by God's blessing. Obedience to God's calling is accompanied by God's blessing. It doesn't mean you're going to be healthy and wealthy and wise, but it will come with God's blessing. And we're going to see as Abraham's life unfolds how he was blessed in his pursuit of obedience to God's calling. But when we obey, it's accompanied by God's blessing. Third thing, I will make your name great. I'm just curious. How many of you, before you walked into church this morning, had ever heard of the name of Abraham before? Okay, hey, that came true then. His name became great. 4,000 years later, we're talking about him. How many of you have ever heard of a guy named Chedorlaomer before? How many of you have heard of Chedorlaomer? Raise your hands. Raise your hands. Well, here's what's weird. In Abraham's generation, this was the most powerful and influential man in his part of the world. Do you know who he was? He was the king of Elam. You've never even heard of Elam. You're like, what's in Elam? It's not there anymore. But in his generation, this was the guy everybody wished they could be, the man with all of the influence. Everybody knew about Chedorlaomer. Nobody heard about Abraham, but look at that. Now you've never heard of the guy, and everyone knows about Abraham. Why is that? Well, I think it's because the Bible's true. You're going to have to figure that out over brunch. And that's fourth blessing. You will be a blessing. Now, this is critical. Too many Christians think that if I follow God, then I'll get the blessing. God says, you do not understand how this works. There's a reason why I bless you. I bless you so that you can be a blessing. That's why God blesses people. so that you can be the blessing to the next person, so that you can be a blessing in your family, in your office, in your circle of friends, in your generation. That's why God blesses Christians, not so that you can get. It's so that you can give, and be a blessing. There's two more promises God gives Abram. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Let's break these down. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. What that means is, don't worry about the outcomes. Don't lose a minute of sleep on how this is all going to pan out. Some people, they're going to love you because you obey my calling, and they're going to bless you. Great. Don't worry about it. Some people, because you follow my calling, they will curse you. Don't worry about it. I've got your back. You worry about following my calling on your life. I'll worry about the outcomes. That's my department. You worry about obeying me. Last one is this. All peoples plurals, in all the nations, all the tribes, all the races, everybody, all peoples on earth will be blessed, not by you. Abraham, you are not going to be the one who blesses all the peoples on the earth, but they will be blessed through you. In other words, what God is saying is this. Abraham's primary contribution to human civilization would not be in what he did, it would be in who he raised. Abraham would raise Isaac, and Isaac would raise Esau and Jacob would raise Judah and his 11 brothers, and Judah would raise Perez, and on and on and on it goes until one day somebody raises Boaz, and Boaz raises Obed, and Obed raises Jesse, and Jesse raises David, who became King David, who raised Solomon, who raised Rehoboam, and on and on and on it goes until one day Jesus is born. This is about Jesus coming into the world. Because Abraham did not bless all the peoples on the world, but Jesus Christ did. Jesus would be the one through whom all people were blessed by Abraham, his great descendant, the Savior of the world. Now, Abraham is not going to see the fulfillment of a lot of these promises, is he? He'll see the fulfillment of some of them, but not all of them. But God sends him out with these promises so that he would have some fuel for the journey to keep him going. Because when God calls, God blesses as he sends. And here's the response. So Abram went as the Lord had told him to do. It's like, Sarah, yeah, pack the salsa. We are moving. Where are we going? I don't know, but we are moving. And when we get there, God will say, time to stop. You've arrived. He had the courage to break his family ties, his cultural ties, and abandon his gods, the gods of his father, to follow the calling of the call of the Lord on his life. And here's a couple summary points before we're done today. First one is this. God calls you. He calls you in to send you out. There's a reason why God calls you in. You're unworthy, he calls you. He says, I want you to know Jesus, your Savior. I'm calling you into my family. I'm calling you to be an heir of heaven. I'm calling you to worship me. And the reason why I'm calling you in, unworthy as you are, is to send you out. The reason why I'm blessing you is so that you might become a blessing. That's why I'm calling you in, because I love you. We're going to spend eternity together, but there's a reason why I haven't brought you all the way. I haven't called you all the way to heaven yet. You're still on the journey so that on your journey, you can be sent out. You can be the blessing in this world. That just like Abraham's world was the runaway train heading in the wrong direction. Go be a blessing in your world. That's why God calls you in. Now, this is so easy to talk about on a stage, and it is so hard to apply in our lives. To embrace the reality that God's call is a complete disruptor for your life, for your agenda, for your finances, for your family. It disrupts everything and can send your life in a whole different direction. Abraham could do that because he had promises from God that if he did that, as he obeyed God's calling, God would show up in these specific ways. But you have something way better than the 6 promises of Abraham. What you have as you answer God's calling for your life, you have the true and better Abraham. Abraham was called to leave his father's house and go to a different country, but the true and better Abraham was called by the Father to leave his father's home in heaven and go to a strange land and live as a foreigner and become homeless. Jesus Christ was called by the Father to leave the Father's home, to come to this earth so that he could be the fulfillment of Abraham's promise, so that he could be the one through whom all peoples on earth would be blessed. Jesus willingly left the home of his Father so that you could be called into the home of your heavenly Father. Jesus gave his life in your place so that you could take his place in heaven with God forever. And when you realize that Jesus did that for you, you can trust God wherever he calls you to go. And that's our last point today. You cannot answer God's calling on your life until you see Jesus answering God's calling on his life. When you see the love of God for what it really is, it gives you the courage to follow God and his calling, his voice in your life. When you see the love of Jesus for what it really is, it destroys consumer mentality. It destroys selfish thinking. And it says, God, tell me what you want me to do so that I may be a blessing. But to go where God calls you to go, as we're going to see in the next few weeks, it will mean you give up some of your security on earth, some of your relationships, some of your agenda. What is it? I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to discern that and wrestle through that with God as he sends you, as he calls you to where he wants you to go. Now, for some of you, as you're listening to this, your realization is, I am so far out of bounds with what I think God has called me to do. How do I even get back to home base? That's what we're going to talk about next week. Because what we're going to discover is no sooner does Abraham get the call after his initial obedience, his train goes way off the tracks. And he's going to show us next week how to get back to the place where you are obeying the call of God on your life. So come back next week for that. But in the meantime, here's what I want you to wrestle through. If you are in a place right now where God says go, when it would be so much easier for you to stay, you need to go. If you are in a place right now where God says stay, when it would be so much easier to go, you need to stay. If God is calling you to give when it would be so much easier to keep, you need to give. When God is saying let go when it would be so much easier for you to hold on, you need to let go. And those expressions of courage have the potential to become a tipping point for something extraordinary in your life and in your faith. We'll pick it up there next Sunday. Let me pray for you. Jesus, if you did all of this for us, we can trust you with whatever you have called us to do. Thank you for calling us to belong to you, for calling us in our unworthiness to become children of God, to receive your forgiveness and grace, and become heirs of eternal life. But now teach us how to live that kind of big life for you and for others, for your glory and for the good of others. Teach us how to live a life like Abraham in obedience to your calling. Please give us a spirit of humility, that our souls and our hearts will be open to hear your calling in our lives, and give us courage to obey you. We ask all of this in your name, Jesus. Amen.